It was supposed to be a quiet night shift. Patrol the streets, check on the usual spots, and drink enough coffee to keep the shadows at bay. But when the call came through at 11:47 p.m., my blood ran cold before I even understood why. Unit 19, respond to a possible break-in at 730 Elm Street, the dispatcher said. Routine stuff, except for her tone. Clipped, almost scared. I parked a block away, keeping the engine running. Elm Street was dark, the streetlights flickering like they'd been plucked from a horror movie set. My flashlight beam cut through the quiet, falling on the house. A dilapidated two-story, abandoned for years. Yet there was movement behind the boarded-up windows. I radioed in. This is Unit 19. I'm on site at Elm. Looks like movement inside. No visible forced entry. Silence. Static. Then a faint voice. Leave. I froze. Dispatch, come again? Only static. Shrugging off the unease, I approached the house, my boots crunching on the gravel driveway. The door creaked open under my touch. No locks, no resistance. Just darkness swallowing my flashlight's beam. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with mildew and something metallic. Blood? Couldn't tell yet. I whispered into my radio. Unit 19, entering premises. Static again. The first floor was empty. Dust-covered furniture, cobwebs stretching across the ceiling, and a fireplace stuffed with old newspapers. But as I turned toward the stairs, I heard it. A faint shuffling overhead. My pulse quickened. This is Officer. My voice caught. What was I doing? Saying my name out loud in a house that felt like it was listening? I started up the stairs, each creak louder than the last. Halfway up, a sound came from above, like a long, wet scrape against wood. The flashlight flickered. The bulb wasn't dying, but the beam stuttered, like something was moving in front of it too fast for me to see. Police! I shouted, my voice stronger than I felt. If someone's up there, make yourself known. No reply, just that scrape again. Longer, closer. At the top of the stairs was a single hallway, lined with doors on either side. All closed. The sound was coming from the far end, behind the last door on the right. My flashlight wavered as I approached, sweat pooling under my vest. The door creaked open before I could touch it. Inside was a room, empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat a man, his back to me. His head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and he was muttering something. A low, guttural chant that sounded less like words and more like a recording played backward. Sir. My voice was barely a whisper. Are you okay? No response. I stepped closer, my hand on my holstered weapon. Sir, I need you to... He snapped his head around to face me, and I stumbled back. His eyes were white. No pupils, no iris, just a milky void. And his mouth. Oh God, his mouth was too wide, stretched into a grin that seemed to split his face. Before I could react, he stood up. Slowly, too slowly, like his joints didn't bend right. His head twisted further than it should have as he looked at me, his grin growing wider. The radio crackled at my side. Get out, came the voice of the dispatcher, except it wasn't her voice. It sounded warped, deep, like something pretending to be her. The man, or whatever he was, took a step toward me, then another. I drew my weapon, hands shaking. Stay back. He didn't stop. When he lunged, it wasn't human. His arms stretched, bones cracking, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. I fired twice. The shots echoed, but he didn't fall. He didn't even flinch. I ran. Down the stairs, through the front door, and into the street. The house seemed darker now, like it was swallowing the light around it. Back in my car, I slammed the door shut and floored it, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the station, gasping for air. Later, I checked the records. There was number 730 Elm Street. The address didn't exist, but my dashcam footage did. And when I played it back, it showed me standing outside the car, staring at an empty lot, talking to someone who wasn't there. Couldn't sleep. The dashcam footage played on a loop in my mind, me, standing in the middle of an empty street, muttering to no one. My shift supervisor, Captain Harris, said I looked pale when I walked in, but I couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. The footage bothered me, but what haunted me most was the radio. The warped, impossible voice that told me to get out. The next day, I sat in the station's small break room, nursing my third cup of stale coffee. The TV was on in the corner, some late-night news recap I wasn't paying attention to when Officer Jenkins walked in. "You okay, man?" he asked, pulling a chair out. "You've been staring into space all day." I hesitated. Jenkins was a good guy, reliable, quick-witted, but I wasn't sure if he'd believe me. "I got a weird call last night," I said finally. Jenkins smirked. "We're cops. Weird calls are part of the gig." "No," I snapped, harsher than I intended. "Not like that. I mean, something I can't explain." His smile faltered. "Like, supernatural?" I didn't answer, but my silence must have said enough. Jenkins leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You ever hear about the tapes?" I frowned. "What tapes?" Jenkins glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "A couple of years back, some rookie was out near Elm Street. Yeah, that Elm Street, when he found a box of old VHS tapes in an abandoned house. Said he watched one and saw things he couldn't explain. Real messed up stuff." "What happened to him?" Jenkins shrugged. "Rumor is he quit the force the next day. Moved halfway across the country. But the tapes? No one knows what happened to them. Some say they're locked up in evidence storage, collecting dust. Others say they disappeared." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why would he even take the tapes in the first place? Jenkins gave me a grim smile. "Some people can't leave well enough alone." I thought about the footage I'd seen, the man with the stretched grin, and the non-existent house. Couldn't be a coincidence. That night, I stayed late at the station, waiting for the building to empty out. Once I was sure I was alone, I made my way down to the evidence locker. The air was stale, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. "Just looking?" I muttered to myself as I rifled through the shelves. Most of it was standard stuff. Bagged drugs, confiscated weapons, boxes of unsolved case files. But then I saw it. An unmarked box shoved into the corner. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. Inside were 3 VHS tapes, each labeled with a date written in black marker. I took the tapes and hurried to the old AV room in the basement, where we still kept a working VHS player. The room smelled of dust and disuse, and the flickering overhead light didn't help my nerves. I slid the first tape into the player and hit play. The footage was grainy, black and white, and completely silent. It showed an empty street. Elm Street, I realized, bathed in moonlight. The timestamp in the corner read 2:34 a.m. For a while, nothing happened. Then, a shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. It moved strangely, like it was jerking in and out of reality. The shadow grew larger until it took the shape of a person. No, not a person. Something humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too small, and its movements were jittery, like a broken marionette. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The figure turned toward the camera. Its eyes glowed white. The screen cut to static. I ejected the tape and sat back, my heart hammering in my chest. By the time I worked up the courage to watch the second tape, it was well past midnight. This one started in what looked like an abandoned house, probably the same house I'd been called to. The camera panned slowly through empty rooms, its operator breathing heavily behind the lens. The air seemed thick, oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. Then, in the corner of the living room, the camera caught something. A woman standing motionless, her back to the camera. The operator called out to her, his voice muffled and shaky. "Hello? Are you okay?" The woman didn't move. The operator stepped closer. "Ma'am." She turned around slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid, like her joints were made of liquid. Her face, it wasn't a face, just smooth, featureless skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The operator screamed, and the camera fell to the floor. The last thing the tape showed was the woman's feet, dragging toward the camera before it cut out. I couldn't bring myself to watch the third tape. Not yet. Instead, I locked the tapes back in their box and returned them to the evidence locker. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. That night I didn't sleep, but the dreams came anyway. They always do. I shouldn't have gone back. But curiosity is a trap, and I'd already taken the bait. The images from the first 2 tapes burned into my mind, whispering questions that I couldn't silence. I had to know what was on the 3rd tape. 2 nights later, I found myself back in the AV room. The air felt colder this time, the shadows in the corners darker. My hand trembled as I slid the last tape into the player. The timestamp read 2005. The screen flickered to life, showing the interior of a moving car. The camera was positioned on the dashboard, aimed at the driver. A man in his late 30s with sunken eyes and a nervous twitch. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, muttering under his breath. The audio was faint, but I could make out fragments. Followed me home. No one believes me. Not crazy. I'm not. The car stopped at a red light. In the mirror, something moved. I leaned closer, my breath catching. At first, it looked like a shadow, indistinct, shapeless, but then it grew. A figure, dark and shimmering like heat haze, materialized in the back seat. The man didn't notice. The figure leaned forward, its hand, if you could call it that, reaching for the man's shoulder. The screen went black. When the footage resumed, the camera was no longer in the car. Instead, it showed a small, dimly lit room. The driver sat in the center, tied to a chair. His face was bruised, his lips trembling. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't mean to take it. I didn't know." The camera operator didn't respond. The driver started to cry, his sobs growing louder. "I'll give it back. Just let me go." The camera tilted downward, revealing what was in the man's lap. A VHS tape, identical to the ones I'd found. Before I could process what I was seeing, the screen cut again. This time, it showed a wide shot of the same dim room, but the chair was empty. The tape was gone. Something moved in the corner of the frame. I paused the video, my hands slick with sweat. The figure was back. It wasn't human, it never had been. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, folding over themselves like a spider's legs. Its face. No, its lack of a face. It was watching the camera. Watching me. I slammed the tape player off, but the screen didn't go dark. The image remained frozen, the faceless thing staring at me through the grainy static. Then the audio kicked in. At first, it was faint, like a whisper of wind, but it grew louder, a low, guttural chant that seemed to vibrate the walls. I couldn't understand the words, but they burrowed into my mind, twisting and pulling like claws. The room felt smaller, the walls closer. My vision tunneled as I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of old file boxes. The chanting stopped. The screen went black. I didn't touch the tapes again. The next day, I told Captain Harris everything. About the call to Elm Street, the non-existent house, and the tapes. I even showed him the dashcam footage. He stared at me for a long time before speaking. "Do you know how many cops have gone to Elm Street?" I shook my head. "Too many. And they all come back with stories like yours. Ghosts, monsters, things that don't belong in this world." He leaned forward, his expression grim. "But here's the thing, every one of them ended up disappearing. A few weeks, a few months, doesn't matter. They all vanish. No signs, no leads, nothing." I felt my stomach drop. "And the tapes?" Harris sighed. "We don't talk about the tapes. But if you've seen them, it's already too late. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've felt it. The weight of something following me. Shadows stretch a little too far, and reflections in mirrors don't match. I see things in my peripheral vision. Flickers of movement, pale hands reaching. Last night, I woke up to static pouring from my TV, even though it wasn't plugged in. And then there's the knocking. Started softly, barely audible, but it's grown louder. Closer. I'm writing this because I don't know how much time I have left. If you're reading this, stay away from Elm Street. Don't ask about the tapes. And if you hear a knock at your door late at night, no matter how human it sounds, don't open it. The knocking came again. Louder. more insistent. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the door. It was almost midnight, the station empty except for me. I hadn't told anyone I was staying late. Not after what Captain Harris said. The knock wasn't normal. It didn't echo like wood or metal. It thudded like a wet fist striking flesh. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. My heart pounded as I stood, reaching for my weapon. My hand trembled as I gripped the cold steel. The knock came again. This time it was accompanied by a sound, low and guttural, like something trying to mimic speech but failing. I inched toward the door, each step slower than the last. "I'm armed," I warned. "Identify yourself." Still nothing, just that wet, sickening knock. Finally, I reached the door. My hand hovered over the handle, every instinct screaming at me to leave it closed. But something compelled me, a pull I couldn't resist. I opened it. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The station was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. Then I saw it. Down the hall, near the evidence locker, a shadow moved. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved jerkily, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Stop!" I shouted, raising my weapon. The figure turned. It had no face, just a smooth, blank canvas where its features should have been. But somehow I knew it was looking at me. Took a step forward. I fired. The shot echoed, the recoil jarring my arm. But the figure didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the tile as I sprinted toward the exit. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to reach for me. Behind me, I heard the thing's footsteps. They weren't heavy, like a person's. They were light, almost insect-like, clicking against the floor. I burst through the station's front door and into the cold night air. My car was parked just a few feet away, but it felt like miles. The sound of clicking grew louder. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped them. "No, no, no," I whispered, scrambling to pick them up. A shadow fell over me. I looked up. The figure was standing at the edge of the parking lot, its head tilted as if studying me. I didn't wait. I jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, tires screeching as I sped down the empty streets. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood motionless, watching me drive away. I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts of town. The road stretched ahead, surrounded by dense woods. I pulled over, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The radio crackled. For a moment I thought it was static, but then I heard it. A voice, faint and warped, like it was coming from underwater. "Come back!" My breath caught. "You can't run!" I slammed the radio off, my chest heaving. The woods were silent. Too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, figures stepping out of the trees. Dozens of them, their faceless heads glowing faintly in the moonlight. They moved in unison, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. They surrounded the car, their blank faces turned toward me. I threw the car into reverse, but before I could move, one of them stepped forward and placed a hand on the hood. His touch was cold, so cold it burned. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out. I was trapped. The last thing I remember is the sound. It wasn't a scream or a growl. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through my chest, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. The figures closed in, their blank faces filling the windows. And then, nothing. I woke up in my bed, the morning sun streaming through the window. For a moment I thought it was a dream, but then I saw the scratches on my arms, the mud on my boots, the strange VHS tape sitting on my nightstand. The label read, 2024. I haven't played it. I won't. If you're reading this, don't go to Elm Street. Don't look for the tapes. And if you ever hear a knock at your door late at night, pray it isn't too late. And that's the end. Good luck sleeping tonight.